So I was listening to the autobiography of Malcolm X
Oh,
yesterday and this morning.
yeah.
So I listened to the first 30 minutes in preparation for this interview because
Nice.
I figured that since so much of what you do is about, race and American history, I'm like, this, I've seen this book around, why not listen to it? And I after learning about his childhood for like the first 30 minutes of the audiobook,
Mm-hmm.
I see where his approach came from.
Mm-hmm.
Because his approach was about force more than it was about love and, kind of taking it to prove a point, as Martin Luther King's was. So, his whole young life was about injustice. That's what I gathered.
Mm-hmm.
It was just like his dad got sliced in half by a train after being beat up by a bunch of people, and it was deemed as a suicide. Every single way he turned, whether it was to a school, to a teacher, they would put him down because he was black. The state saw him as a number, and that was what it says in the book. But ultimately, it transformed him, and it gave him this sense of anger towards a cause, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what are your thoughts on the book?
Well, the book's very interesting. It was written by Alex Haley in conversation with Malcolm X, and it was quite a sensational its publication was quite sensational at the time, as you can imagine. Malcolm X, it's interesting the duality you find in the Black history experience. There's often a kind of split of two different philosophies, and certainly during the time of Malcolm X, he was often paired with Martin Luther King, right? So you have completely different attitudes towards the story of race. Malcolm's was much more, as you said, more dependent upon force. It was more angry, more resistant. He thought that he mocked the work of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement by saying that you expend all this energy and all this time, and what do you get to be able to use the same toilet next to a white person? In other words, he was minimizing the achievements of the civil rights movement. Malcolm X was a brilliant man. I mean, and you're right. The story of his youth, the story of his family, the burning of his home, of his childhood home, and the spotlight that put upon the abuse of Black Americans in that time was hugely important. If you go back, for instance, I'm going to go back to this duality notion. You go back to the turn of the century, and you look at what were the two big Black leaders of the turn of the century. I mean, the turn to the 19th to the 20th centuries, right? And it was Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, and they act just like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. They define two completely different approaches to how to deal with race in America. And Booker T. Washington wrote a book called Up from Slavery. He was every white person's favorite Black at the time because he was actually not interested in resisting and the white power structure. He was interested in actually developing American Black lives within a segregated community, with the idea that if you gained skills and worked on and educated the Black race, that they had a better chance of succeeding in moving forward than they would if they took the W.E.B. Du Bois point of view, which was to say that they needed to have more freedoms. They needed to have more to be released from the degradation of Jim Crow. And Du Bois was the more intellectual of the two. Booker T. Washington was more of a tradesman, and Washington was the first person to dine at the White House, first Black person to dine at the White House. But Du Bois was really, I think, a more forceful figure, and ultimately Du Bois's attitude won out. I mean, Du Bois was part of the beginning of the NAACP. He edited a magazine called Crisis. He was an incredibly important, incredibly gifted man who's well worth the study of your listeners.
So one thing I took as well from the book is one of his major quotes that I took to kind of explain the rest of his life is from a young age, he learned that if he wanted to get anything, he would have to make some noise.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, it through his entire life, I can only imagine the amount of frustration he has because imagine everywhere you go. And as I was reading, I was thinking, or not reading, listening, I was thinking about it where, his mom, I believe, developed dementia, if I'm not mistaken. She became unwell at the very least. And in any event, she became unable to really communicate by the end of it. And this is all at a very young age, like from as a kid
Mm-hmm.
all the way to now, like to my age, he was just endlessly, not tormented, but just everywhere he went was an injustice towards him, or it was some type of misfortune, right? So it was a lot of societal as well as existential injustices.
Mm-hmm.
So part of it was just the unfairness of existence. Like he can't really control his mother getting dementia. Nobody can, unfortunately. But then there's the societal aspect of it, which I think is what motivated him far more, which was the aspects of again having his home be burnt down and all the
Yeah.
police officers and firemen just watch it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my question to you is ultimately, what do we learn from a man like Malcolm X? Like, what is
Yeah.
the major lesson that his life teaches us?
Well, it's been a long time since I read the book, so you're reminding me of certain things that I wouldn't have been able to speak about off the tip of my tongue. But I will say that one of the things that Malcolm X taught us was the value of education. I don't know how far you got into the book, but he was on his way to a pretty desperate life, a life of crime, petty crime, imprisonment, um, really not a centered and productive human being. When he was in prison, though, he spent all his time reading. And he talks a lot about this, the importance of access to books, and how education. In fact, I was writing something not too long ago about the attack on education going on now in American schools. You're probably familiar with this, that there's a attempt from the really mostly throughout the South and the sort of rural Midwest to try to tailor the public school education to minimize the slavery and its effects, and to uh, try to teach history in a way that will not make white people feel guilty, which means teaching history that is really a lie, right? I mean, there's so many parts of American history that are shameful moments, but that doesn't mean that we're a shameful country. It doesn't mean we're shameful people. I can go on about that, but one of the things that struck me in the course of the study of this attack on the public education was the degree to which hiding access to education, hiding access to books and literature, which is part of its manifestation. The libraries have been told to remove certain books that they felt were. I don't know if actually the autobiography of Malcolm X has been removed anywhere. I wouldn't be surprised if it was, on the notion that it might give some students ideas, with quotes around it. Um, and it might make white people feel guilty, white children feel guilty about their history and their nation. But the point I wanted to make is that Malcolm X was someone who believed in education, thought education freed him to be able to become the person he was and to be able to become the leader that he was, right? And so now it's not surprising. In fact, I'll go back even further. Frederick Douglass. I imagine your listeners are familiar with the name Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was extraordinary American, just extraordinary American, who was born into slavery, escaped from slavery as an adult, came to the North, became a an ardent abolitionist, a part of the abolitionist movement, and fantastic orator. And one of the key elements of his success was that as a young child growing up in slavery, he had paid. We would pay with his little or trade or barter with the white children of the plantation that he was working, that he was enslaved to teach him how to read. To teach him how to read. And in fact, the wife of the plantation owner took such an interest in this young black child who wanted to read that she decided she was going to continue his education until she was confronted by her husband, who said, "You know what will happen if we educate the slaves? They'll want to be free." So that story is echoed in the writings of Malcolm X, uh, not literally, but echoed in the notion that education is the reading is the a path to freedom. And so Malcolm uh, became himself only after he had, ironically, the prison experience where he would spend most of his time in the prison library. Have you ever seen the Spike Lee movie about Malcolm X? It's actually based upon the book. You should seek that out. It's really a fabulous movie. I mean, Spike Lee is an incredibly powerful director, but you'll see the Malcolm story played out in cinematic form there. By the way, my writing colleague Mark Lamont Hill, who I've written a lot of things with, had a child 2 years ago, and he named the child Malcolm.
So yeah, so with regards to everything you're saying and Malcolm X as a person and everything about him, I think so. Do you know, you're familiar with Robert Greene, correct?
Robert Greene?
Yeah.
No.
So he's the author of the 48 Laws of Power and the Laws of Human Nature, and he was giving an interview one time, and he spoke about he spoke about two things. Number one, that highly charismatic people such as JFK or Marilyn Monroe become such a way because, charismatic people are often from bad families, bad homes, bad childhoods, and as a result, they need to learn their way, and they usually do that through people, right? So they learn this charisma, this ability to get people to like them through these hard, almost impossible experiences. Number one. So I think that is a part of his character, right? Number two, in an interview Robert Greene gave, he spoke about how people that have a lot of anger, right? The way that they can channel it is through a cause, right? And Malcolm X, I think, was driven by the emotion of anger, right? And frustration. I think that's what drove him ultimately. And I think his goal, right, was decently noble. Like it's the idea of freeing black people from segregation and all these injustices in society, right? But he did it through the conduit of anger, of channeling anger almost, right? Because again, like imagine again from his perspective, if we're personalizing this, going through everything you went through, all that his life taught him was that, if you follow the system fails you, right? So ultimately, after he went through these experiences as a kid,
or the system is constructed so you will fail,
right? So that people will benefit from your failing.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I think is what he ultimately learned from it, from his younger years. Then, as he got older, he realized that by not following the system, he got farther and he got further and he got better than when he was following the system, which ultimately taught him that the system is flawed, or that is constructed, as you said, in a manner that will cause him to fail. So in both circumstances, he has nothing but motivation to ultimately go against the systems that, created him to be what he was, right? Or that led him on the path that it did. overall, I have nothing but good things to say about him, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing I can definitely say for a fact is that he was angry and that he was driven
Mm-hmm.
a lot by that anger.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, I don't think he was the only one who was driven by anger in the time, and his sort of competitor leader was Martin Luther King, who was also driven by anger in a different way. But I think that Malcolm was the more militant voice of the time, and he expressed, whereas Martin Luther King tended to appeal particularly to white Americans for his message of I want people to be judged by the content of their character instead of by the color of their skin. That was appealing to white Americans. He became white America's favorite black leader, just like Booker T. Washington had been 70 years before that. Although I would never want to equate King with Booker T. Washington otherwise than that. And a lot of King's words have been misused. King's phrases have been misused. In fact, they're used now to argue against affirmative action. They're used to argue against any kind of favorable treatment to compensate for the damages that slavery and the continuing subjugation of the black race has brought. But back to Malcolm, I think that he had, he sort of awakened in black people in particular, but others as well, this sense of outrage, and that working through the system, as you said, was not going to get them anywhere. Working through, asking Congress to do certain things was not going to get them anywhere. That they needed to express the outrage, and only through the outrage would they get results. And that outrage could be oratorical, it could be violence, it could be a provocative stand on America and its race relations. But whatever it was a better route to the goals that they wanted to reach than the one that Martin Luther King was occupying.
Right. So Martin Luther King, his again, as you said, they were both driven by a frustration and an anger, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
again, both of them came to a mutual understanding, right? That, I mean, no matter what, they might have disagreed on their methods, but they disagreed on the problem. That
Mm-hmm.
is that black people, right? I mean, you could extend it even to all races, but mainly black people at the time were being persecuted unfairly. They were being treated unfairly. They were being everything that they did not have the same life as a white person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which, goes against every ideal of America that, everyone's
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be equal. And they agree generally that the problem is that white people have a better life than black people. And that's unfair.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a correct argument. However, right, their methods are completely different.
Mm-hmm.
As Martin Luther King and his methods were not only about love, but about proving a point. So his methods were that by not doing anything, and that by not fighting, at least not through force,
Mm-hmm.
that by being attacked and by letting people attack him, it proved more of a point,
Mm-hmm.
because it proved how evil the other side is. Because if you start fighting force with force,
Mm-hmm.
then each side could justify that their actions were justified, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially the second person who got attacked, right, and attacked back. However, if you don't even fight back and that person continues to attack you, the truth is that person is evil and has a hatred towards you. So in Martin Luther King's defense, it proved a greater point
Mm-hmm.
of that by making yourself the example and by proving that you're doing this out of your own will and by letting yourself getting attacked, you are proving the point that the other side just hates you for no reason, will continue to attack you without justification. And it ultimately disproves the other side because because they cannot argue that whatever they're doing is justified.
Mm-hmm.
right? Whereas when you get a man like Malcolm X, the problem is that it leads to escalation.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, right? And I'm not against, being forceful in your opinions necessarily, but the flaw with Martin Luther King is that it requires yourself to be a sacrificial object, basically, and for
Mm-hmm.
you to sacrifice yourself. The problem with Malcolm X's approach is that it escalates. So you might be attacked, and then you attack them back, but then
Mm-hmm.
they're going to hit you harder, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you're gonna have to hit them harder, and then it leads to a point where then it's an all-out war between two extreme sides.
Mm-hmm.
So both of them have, to some extent, they're both correct about each other, right? That the other side is flawed
Mm-hmm.
in some way, but it's ultimately a question of, how it's just a question of method, basically, of what do you really want in the end. Like, I think King's method was more effective in the end because it proved his point much further than Malcolm X did. But Malcolm X's point, is also fair, that it's an act of self-defense. Like, why should I think his there was a quote by him where it's, why should the or not even a quote, but it's a summary I heard of his opinion. It's like, why should the action of being the bigger person fall onto the victim, the
Mm-hmm.
oppressed, not the oppressor,
Mm-hmm.
right? And why does this happen all throughout history,
Mm-hmm.
where the oppressed don't do anything about it and they continue to get oppressed?
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, what's the solution to that? You rebel,
Mm-hmm.
but then that leads to more violence.
Mm-hmm. Well, a couple of things about this. Number one, yes, you're right about King. He practiced passive resistance, right? Which he had learned from Gandhi in his experience in India. By occupying the place of not only passivity in terms of, I guess I shouldn't call it passivity because it wasn't passive in the sense that it still resisted, but it was in a passive form. And that was sort of the approach of the entire civil rights movement in the 1960s. And it achieved legislation that was significant. I remember that there had been a lot of groundwork already done in the 1950s by the Supreme Court with Brown versus the Board of Education, by the push for black students to attend schools in Little Rock and in other parts of the country that have been whites only form of education. You have Rosa Parks too, who famously refused to sit in the black section of the bus. So you have all these things sort of building that are happening. If you want to go back even further, go back to 1948 when Harry Truman decides after the Second World War to desegregate the armed forces. So these things were, and Jackie Robinson, for that matter, the famous first black player in Major League Baseball, he too practiced a kind of passive resistance when he was recruited by Branch Rickey, who was the general manager of the Dodgers. His message was Branch Rickey's message to Jackie Robinson was, do not engage with any fight. Do not take on any kind of verbal abuse. Do your job. Go to the dugout. Yes, go to the black hotel when all the white players are going to the white hotels. Eat in the black restaurants when all the rest of the players are eating in the white restaurants. Do so with such dignity that people will see that it is inhumane and unjust for the black population to be excluded from Major League Baseball. Now, you could very well say, as you just did, why is it that a black man needs to be anything other than who he is? That he needs to occupy a higher standard of moral rectitude and of a kind of selflessness in order to be able to be just a part of the society that he lives in, and to have equal access to education, to sports, to hotels, to restaurants, to be able to have success in business and in academia and everywhere. So you're right that would have been Malcolm X's response was, why must I be the sort of passive person waiting for white race to recognize that I deserve to be among them. Now, King, famously, of course, we have the march on Washington. We have the march, the Bloody Sunday March, which John Lewis was a part of. I'm sure you know that. Which was and the hosing of the protesters in Birmingham, the power hosing by Bull Connor. All these are all moments in which you have the violence really on the white side, and the dignity and discipline on the black side in each of those instances. Malcolm would never have joined into such a strategy, right? He would never have done that. I think in a way you need both. And I would say, even going back to the stories I told you about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, you need both. What Washington was arguing was that they needed to have segregation in order to build up black skills, black businesses, black communities. When people have been freed from slavery, his argument was they're not prepared to simply walk into white society and be a fully equal member. They need to have time to build the history of the free black race in America before they can be judged. Otherwise, you're setting them up for defeat, right? And Washington was right in some ways and wrong in other ways. And Du Bois was right in some ways and wrong in some other ways. I mean, I think ultimately, it's interesting. Ultimately, I would say that in the 20th century, Du Bois won out as the superior leader, whose ideas and whose strategy was the triumphant one. And I would say for a long time, people thought Martin Luther King was the one that won out towards the end of the 20th century and into the 21st. I would argue that it's kind of shifted, and that one of the reasons it shifted is that even as they received, with the Civil Rights Act, with the Voting Rights Act, the further destruction of Jim Crow, and greater access to as a full members of society. The experience of the past few years has shown us that the kind of racism that delivered slavery and then Jim Crow and then the abuses, the utter devastating abuses of the black race in America, is systemic. And it came to light really from 2020 onward with the killing of George Floyd. I think the message of the killing of George Floyd, actually came out of the reaction to the killing of George Floyd, was that racism is still with us. Even when the law may forbid it, it is practiced on a level that is sub rosa, sort of below the surface. And that the systems and the institutions that define American society are rife with the kind of racial hierarchy that shows that we haven't gone that far. We have not made great achievements. And that bangs up very hard against the American assumptions, I would say, post-civil rights movement, that the civil rights movement was a great success and that we live now in a society that respects equality. Well, we don't. And I think the fact that was proven by the experience not only of George Floyd, but innumerable other incidents in which police were the aggressors against innocent black men and women, and that their experience with law enforcement was anything but equal. The fact that so many avenues in American life are still barred to black people was understood in a different way. So that now we're seeing a greater belief in what the ideas that Malcolm actually was pushing way back in the 1960s. your listeners, your viewers may be interested in reading a lot of the. I've always been fascinated by the work of James Baldwin. Do you know the name James Baldwin? Novelist and writer, essay writer, who wrote in the 1940s up to the 1980s, and his attitude is very, very much consistent with the attitudes of Malcolm X in terms of his belief that number one, a more a more aggressive resistance is necessary, and number two, that the problem is systemic. Way before any of these ideas began being accepted into the American mainstream.
Well, I think that we also have to understand where the root of racism comes from, right? And I think it, strangely enough, comes from a similar place that, in some cases, religion might hold for some people, right? Now, I'm not an atheist. When it comes to ideas like religion or racism or cults or whatever term you like, whatever organization you might want to use, they all have one thing in common, and that is that they unite people under a common cause, and they give people a why. Like, they give people a reason to believe. So I'll take, in terms of racism, what I mean by that is, take an organization like the Ku Klux Klan, for example, or Nazism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both of them are uniting a group of people under a common cause. Now, that common cause is evil. Yes, 100%. The eradication or obliteration of a race of people is evil no matter what. And there's almost, well, no, not almost, there is no justification for it at all. However, by, uniting these people, they have now agreed that there is a reason. They've been given an understanding as to why things happen, right? And they like that reason, and they're comfortable in it. So we could even go back as far as slavery, right? And in the time of slavery, right? That's just when people have that system, and this was a major justification for why people were doing it, was for economic reasons of, well, this is the way that we've always done it. Why are we going to change it? There's more benefits to doing than not economically. Like, they were making these justifications. They're bending over backwards to deprive people of their rights. But the reason why is because it benefited them, right? And it was just easier to go along with the system for many white people than it was, and even many black people in some cases, rather than to make a noise and to say something about it and to speak up and stand up. Because when people did stand up, I mean, Martin Luther King had his house firebombed like many, many times. And that's a known thing. People would drive by and throw bombs at his house. Like, it's crazy the amount of attacks these people faced. So imagine how much bravery that would require. So eventually people get comfortable in the system of racism, right? And they get united under these causes, which are flawed and they're wrong and they're evil. And again, we keep on saying this, but where it comes from is a lack of not a lack of understanding, but I think there's a dishonesty in it where they know that it's wrong, but they will bend over backwards to attempt to justify that they're doing it for more than just themselves, and they're doing it for more than just the reason to feel superior, So again, if we're taking the idea of Nazism as an example, right? People believed it because they believed that they were returning to the German motherland, right? Like, or they were trying to benefit Germany in some way. So a lot of people that were white supremacists for many years in American history, it was because of white culture and to preserve white culture and things of that nature. So, it's flawed. It's I don't know the right word to put here. I guess flawed people, number one, and as well as evil people, people that want power and people that want to maintain these systems, right? Because it benefits them, as well as this desire to keep things in the status quo, especially if the status quo benefits you. And ultimately, it culminates in depravities and atrocities. But it's very important that people understand why it happens. So, like, again, I could go on for days about why people do this and why people do evil, but that is a very big reason, is that it makes in a strange way, it brings people, again, under a common cause. It gives people a reason why things are bad. It gives people cop-out answers. That's a good way to put it. It gives people answers of, well, this group of people is doing this. This is the problem. That's what Hitler did, right? And that's what many people have done. So I think you're understanding what my point is.
I am. I'm not sure I 100% agree with it. I think that there was a kind of root belief in white supremacy that defined much of human history, not just in America. The idea that that there is a strata of race. I mean, there's a wonderful book by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste, which is very interesting study of the history of peoples around the world subjugating other peoples on the basis of the color of their skin, their ethnicity, the place where they were born, not just on the matter of that. Well, there was certain ecological or natural resource issues that prevented one people from being successful over another, but on the basis of their inferiority. And as late as the late 19th century, there were still many scientists who believed that the black race was inferior and had a scientific, I put quotes around that, scientific explanations for why they were inferior. And I don't think that that it's interesting. I think I would say to your point that in the time since the Civil War, when the Confederacy and the old Confederacy and those who mourned its end changed the story of the Civil War, began rewriting it in a way that defined what the war was about, not about slavery, but about as what's commonly called the myth of the lost cause, which is that the Confederacy was really a defense of individual and state rights, not having anything to do with the practice of slavery. And I mean, it's an interesting. It's interesting that the history of that thinking, which not only dominates the justifications for Jim Crow, for instance, in the early 1900s, but the academic approach to American history accepted that the lost cause, and not uniformly accepted it, but there were a large number of historians who working in that time who believed that, yes, we misunderstood the Civil War. The South was actually fighting to not have to acquiesce to Washington and to the federal government. They wanted to retain their states, the state control over the institutions in their states, including slavery, and that they always intended that slavery would end. And it's, I think, a fallacy. It's very clear the Civil War was about preserving slavery. So in the sense of what you're describing here about there being a papering over of it, that it was essential to our economic success, and essential for us to prevent being ruled by the financial powers of the North. These are things that were argued in order to not have to confront the fact that they were not only white supremacist thinkers, but they acted in ways to preserve white supremacy. And I would argue it comes right up to our present day. The movement to shield children in schools from the true story of the Civil War, including such strange euphemisms that justify what slavery itself was. Don't call it slavery anymore. These are things that still hold on to this idea that the white race is supreme to a lot of the races.
Right. So when I'm talking about the papering over of it, and I'm getting to the point that, nobody is the villain of their own story, right? So nobody wants to believe that they are in the wrong, and and if they're doing something wrong, they know it's wrong, and they can even feel internally that it's wrong, and they're lying to themselves. But oftentimes there's also there's the aspect that they have to keep telling themselves this because they want to believe that they are in the right.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there's many examples of that through history, but twisted people, That's a very like vague, broad term, but twisted, bad, evil people will bend over backwards throughout history to justify not what they believe necessarily, but what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So we could extend this to Joseph Stalin, right? We could extend this to Hitler. We could extend this to slave masters and plantation owners. All these people have one thing in common, that they benefited from in some way what they were doing, but more specifically, they bent over backwards to justify it other than, I want power, or, I don't want to do the hard work, or I don't want to pay these people.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's, again, it's much, it would, so when I'm saying this, I'm saying that for the plantation owners and people like that, in terms of American history, they bent over backwards, not just because they necessarily hated Black people, but also because they were given a system that purely benefited them in every single way. They didn't have to pay people. And they could kill them whenever they wanted. And ultimately, they benefited so much from it that they decided that they would do everything in their power to justify it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it is evil, 100%. Everything about racism is evil, right? Saying that my race is better than yours,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to justify that is evil, and it's a flawed way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But where that thinking comes from is just like an extreme level of delusion and dishonesty, and wanting to believe in something that they know isn't true. It comes from a number of things. I could go into detail all day about it, but I think it's
I think it's I would urge you. I'm pleased you have this wonderful podcast. This is a great piece of initiative on your part, and that you want to interview people who want to talk about ideas. I think is very impressive. There's a friend of mine who wrote a book on the childhood experience of tyrants in human history, focusing really on Hitler, Mussolini, Mao, Stalin, and what he's looking for there is, how is it that somebody who was at one point a cute and cuddly baby ends up being this ruthless killer of millions of people. And it's worth having him on, because I think you'd find him very interesting on this study. He teaches at a small school up in New England, and he's a great speaker, and I urge you to do that, because what you're looking at, I think, here more broadly is the notion of, where does the evil start, really, right? Where's the beginning of this? How is it that things evolve to the point where people are willingly joining the Nazi Party, believing that they are doing the right thing, when in fact they are being party to this incredibly destructive and evil force that ends up really destroying huge swaths of the history of the world in the mid 20th century, including the annihilation of millions and millions of people. So I would urge you that I'll give you his contact information afterwards, but I think you'd find him an interesting person to talk to on this very subject.
I appreciate that, and we'll talk about that when we're done with this. So yeah. I want to ask you more now. So talk to me about Abraham Lincoln, because you wrote a book on him, Lincoln's Gambit. So
Gamble,
I remember
Gamble, not Gambit, Gamble. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. So when I was doing the research for this, I was watching a lecture of yours from 10 years ago, 2015. Oh, really? It was 9 years ago, but which is crazy to think. But when I was watching it, you made kind of a funny joke where you're like, at this point, what can be different about my narrative of Lincoln's story?
Yeah.
So talk to me about what was different about your story.
Sure. Yeah. No, I used to talk about the number of books that have been written about Lincoln. There's tens of thousands of books that have been written about Lincoln. So the idea of an author coming to a publisher and saying, I want to write a book about Lincoln, is something where you could imagine the editor looking and saying, "Yo, yet another one, right? What else is there to be said about him?" Well, he's an endlessly fascinating person to begin with, right? Not only a great president, but a great orator, a great writer, a great thinker, a great lawyer. I have with a deep understanding of the Constitution and of American history, of the founders. Um, uh, an amazing human being, really. Um, who and that justifies the level of study that we have on him. I mean, there are many people who devote their lives. I wrote one book. Many people who devote their lives to writing about Lincoln. Many historians, and even some non-historians. I mean, there are people that have achieved great scholarship without being an historian, without being a trained scholar, but they nonetheless have written fabulous books, interesting books about Lincoln. I thought that it was interesting to consider so I wrote a whole book about the history of the 20th century, and saw so many threads going back from there to Lincoln. The growth of the federal government goes back to Lincoln. The notion of the cliche is to say that before the Civil War, people would say the United States are, like it's a plural, right? After the Civil War, they'd say the United States is, because now it was one singular state entity that was joined together. Why? Well, largely because of Lincoln, and not only the story of the Civil War and the ending of slavery and the Civil War amendments to the Constitution, but just this notion that we occupy a national political structure and a national culture is derived from Lincoln, and then the mid to late 19th century. And because it gets enormously expanded in the 20th century with FDR and the growth of the administrative state, and now we're seeing political leaders emerge to actually try to take apart the administrative state. What I found interesting, though, was everybody had said, when I was a child, everybody said, "Well, Lincoln freed the slaves, right? Lincoln freed the slaves." And I thought, okay, Lincoln freed the slaves. That's an amazing thing. Well, I mean, that's like a biblical thing, right? I mean, if you live your life and you do something as grand as that, it's almost, you can see why you be the subject of myth, right? And the subject of legend. People would write tens of thousands of books about you. Can't say the same thing about Millard Fillmore or Martin Van Buren. These presidents were also in the 19th century. But in the course of learning and reading more about Lincoln, as I had for decades, I began to realize that for Lincoln, it was a more complicated subject, and that he didn't know the right moral path from the moment he emerged into his adult life. He had to grow into it himself, and he had a tremendous amount of doubt. When we get to the story of the Civil War, he had a tremendous amount of doubt about everything he did. He was a thinking person, and thinking people are not only capable of reasoning, but they're also capable of having to justify things that interrupt a singular point of view about something. Lincoln, when Lincoln ran for the presidency, he did not intend to free the slaves while he was president. He was hoping that he could get some agreement with the southern plantation states to end slavery gradually over a period of decades. And had the South accepted that, we would not have had a civil war. I mean, we would have the end of slavery, but it would have been decades off. But for some of the very same reasons that you articulated earlier, which had to do with, how can we just radically change our economic system in the South? How can we radically change our culture? How can we introduce this huge swath of our population into freedom without their having had that experience? All these things were in Lincoln's mind. And because he was a great thinker, he had a lot to contend with when the time came with the nation torn apart. you remember that he said famously, if I could restore the Union uh, by uh, by freeing the slaves, I would free the slaves. If I could just save the Union by preserving slavery, I would preserve slavery. Uh, in other words, the primary thing to him was maintaining the Union. And he had a very, very complicated but very impressive argument for why it was unlawful for the Southern states to secede. Nonetheless, by the time he becomes president, in fact, shortly after his election, states begin to secede from the nation. They knew what was coming, or they believed they knew what was coming. And Lincoln had only had a plurality of the vote. He hadn't had a majority of the vote. He ran against four other candidates. Or was it three other candidates? Three or four, I forget. Major candidates, that is, who some of whom wanted to maintain slavery intact, some of whom wanted to more gradually move away from slavery. But the point was that Lincoln was not elected by a majority of the people. There's some states in which he wasn't even on the ballot. In part because the way that the elections worked at that time was that the party itself was the one who registered you and who delivered your vote to the authorities to be able. So if you didn't have a party, which you didn't have a Republican Party in a lot of the southern states, there was nobody to organize the vote, which again says how split the country was, and we're experiencing that now. But what I was interested in was what was going on in Lincoln's mind as he went through both the war and ultimately with this decision to free the slaves, which culminated in the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued on January 1, 1863. And what I discovered was, despite his mandate that he would not free the slaves, but we seek a compromise with the southern states to be able to free slavery over a long period of time, that he had grave doubts about sustaining that argument, and instead decided around the beginning of July of 1862 that he was going to, as a war measure, free the slaves. Now, the reason he had to do it as a war measure is because the slaves were understood under the Constitution to be property. They were personal property, meaning that he could not, under the Constitution, free the slaves with a wave of the hand. He would be operating against the constitutional respect for personal property. So he had to do it as a war measure. He said, okay, I'm only freeing the slaves in order to be able to defeat the Confederate mission to secede. And that meant that he freed the slaves in states where there was slavery, and ironically was not able to free slaves in states where there was no slavery, even though there had been pockets of slavery in those states. So he says this to Secretary of State William Seward in early July 1862. And then, over the next 6 months, before he issues the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, he has enormous numbers of doubts. Number one, about whether even that, as an aspect, as a tactic of war, is acceptable. But whether the freeing of the slaves suggests that they are equal, which he did not believe. He did not believe black people and white people are equal. But he believed that slavery as an institution needed to end. And he goes back and forth about all of this, including telling groups of people, no, I don't intend to do it. And other people, yes, I do intend to do it. All the while, and the Lincoln movies, again, a wonderful thing for your viewers here, or your podcast listeners, that the movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis shows this scene in which Lincoln would show up at the telegraph room, which was a new technology at the time, in order to witness the telegrams coming through on the progress of the war. Excuse me. And while he was doing that, watching the way this was happening, he was penning the Emancipation Proclamation in its early drafts, then putting it in a drawer, locking the drawer, and coming back the next day, opening it up, and again working on it as he watches everybody. There's lively banter going on with the telegraph operators. The scene is actually played out beautifully in the movie Lincoln. And every time he works on it, he changes something, he changes the language. It's clear that he is struggling with this. And only after the Battle of Antietam, which was nominally a Union victory, but not a conquest, does he begin in earnest to work on the Emancipation Proclamation. And even up to the last day, December 31st, when there were rumors that he was going to sign this into law on January 1, Frederick Douglass, we talked about before, says he does not believe he will deliver the Emancipation Right. He doesn't believe it's going to happen. He thinks that Lincoln's going to let that deadline pass. And so what you've witnessed in those 6 months is the doubts, the struggles, the justifications, the legal maneuvering for Lincoln to issue this phenomenal document, probably along with the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the third most important document in American history. Not a piece of poetry, by the way. It's a legal document. It's a single-page legal document, and in those struggles, you see a human being, not a mythic figure, but a human being in the position of the presidency with enormous power, struggling to make this decision that is surely one of the most monumental decisions in American history. And I say that importantly, that he's a person, not a mythic leader, which he has been made into by so many people. It was particularly in the early 20th century, the years after the war. But because he is a person, he feels that he doesn't possess the kind of confidence and surety that will be necessary to make such a decision. He even wonders if anybody can be freed by another human being. That freedom is something given by God. He was not a deeply religious person. He was more like a deist in the way that the early founders were, not an avid churchgoer, although he would show up to church, and he believed in a kind of a God of consultation, someone you would look to. He references this in the second inaugural speech, that his bewilderment that God wills this war to continue, he says, and so we must deal with the fact that whatever is happening, he's willing it to continue. In other words, the fate is around us. We have to deal with it. But Lincoln does wonder, how is it possible that I, a human being, can free slaves when God is the only person? Our humanity is free. This is a deeply embedded in American founding documents, American principles. But before the Enlightenment, it was not given at all that people were free. You were a subject. You were a subject of the queen or the king, or you were a serf or whatever. You belonged to somebody else. So the notion of freeing the slaves and what that might do also to the country, would that mean that he would end up presiding over the defeat of the Union in the Civil War? He didn't know. There were no polls back then. Nothing to consult. So he was able to make the decision more on the rightness of the decision than looking for what the political advantage it might gain him if he did it. So, I mean, I urge your listeners to go out and get a copy of Lincoln's Gamble. I don't get any money for more purchases. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying because I think it's an interesting study. It goes only from the months of July 1862 to January 1863. But I argue that those are among the most critical 6 months in American history. And they all depended upon the decision-making of one man and the machinations he went through in his mind over whether he should do it or whether he should not. As late as September, he's basically of 1862, he's basically offering again the South the idea that, well, if you will free the slaves, agree to freeing the slaves on a gradual basis, I'll accept that. They won't do it. They won't do it. They could have ended the war right there. But Lincoln I urge your listeners, is a worthy study, and there are hundreds of wonderful books on the subject.
So
I should probably go
yeah,
very soon. I don't know what
yeah,
how much more you want to do, but
yeah. No, this is good. I think a good place to end off would be I don't know how long your answer would be for this question, but ultimately, with everything you've seen, everything you've learned about racism and where it comes from, and studying it, to a point where the average person can't even come close, what is the solution or the cure to the ideal of one race being better or superior or otherwise better than another? What is the
yeah,
ultimate key to solving that idea or the following of that idea?
it's a very good question, and I would say that you know, racism um, is as old as human history. Um, it's embedded in our human consciousness. It's trying to, in some way, by say racism, I should say just the idea more that how can I distinguish myself from others and be better than they are? There's a natural competitive element that leads to that kind of thinking. Um, I think that because there is a natural human, and some of it comes out of insecurity too, by the way, there's a natural civilizational uh, history to that has led societies all over the world to grade people according to certain other extra characterological details, like race, like ethnicity, like education, like where you were born, the nature of your family, all these things. And it's an aspect of civilization that we curb all the sort of more disturbing elements of the human um, character. We have laws that say you can't go out and murder someone. We have laws that say you can't practice fraud. We have laws that say you have to stay within a certain speed limit. The laws are all generated in order to try to discourage the activity that we know is inherently destructive. So have we done then with race. But it took many, many years to get there. Excuse me. But when we educate people, number one, not we educate people to understand that all peoples are flawed. That um, the white race is flawed, the black race is flawed, the educated people are flawed, the uneducated people are flawed, the people from this region, the people from that region, and that our common quest is to civilize ourselves in order to be able to elevate the human experience to one that if you want to go look at religions, this is sort of the impulse of religions in order to both accommodate our mortality, but also reach for the ideals of a kind of immortality, right? And that's in Christianity, it's in Judaism, it's in Islam, it's everywhere. White supremacy, racism, are all part of that thing we need to educate in ourselves. And so when I hear that educate against in ourselves, when I hear that schools are being told to tamp down on the negative aspects of American history, I think of it more on a characterological individual point of view. You would not do very well in life if you didn't recognize your own flaws, if you didn't recognize the historical consequences of your flaws, and try to be a better person the next day, right? Christianity certainly teaches that. Judaism teaches that. Islam teaches that. We need to make it more acceptable for we as Americans to both understand our flawed history, recognize our very virtuous and lofty ideals, and realize that confronting our flaws, confronting our mistakes, confronting our own evils at times will make us better as a country, better as a people. And that until we do that, until we are able to accept that and look to reinforce the kind of respect for equality that we lack in this country, I think we're going to be still stumbling from it. And we have a political election going on right now, which is a stark difference between the attitudes about this idea. So my final comment to your listeners would be to say, be open-minded, understand the way that society works is to always be flawed, but the virtue lies in the person who's willing to confront those flaws, attend to the lofty ideals, and move forward, not to hide from it, not to say, well, we didn't do that, or not to say that really what we were doing, alluding to what you were saying before, was because of economic reasons, but to confront it.
I think that's a great place to end off. I'm going to stop the recording. We'll talk a little bit after the show because I know you have to go. But I really appreciate you coming on, and I think this was a very helpful and great talk.
Good.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Wish you well.
Right to me.
3,
Yeah. Okay.
2, 1.